Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CJCA Positive Youth Development Committee Education Webinar Series. This is our 9th in a series of webinars this year focused on education in the juvenile justice system. Today's webinar focuses on special education, youth with special needs. I want to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this webinar series, and a special thanks to Peter Forbes, Commissioner of Massachusetts DYS, and Michelle Phillips, also from Massachusetts DYS, Phil Harris from Temple University, and Simone Gonsolin, the American Institute of Research, who have all put a great deal of work into preparation of these webinars, as well as our presenters for today, who Peter will introduce in just a couple of minutes. For those of you who might be new to CJCA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and most importantly, the long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJCA represents the youth juvenile justice system CEOs in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and various major metropolitan counties across the country. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Jonah for a few of our technical directions.
Thank you, Mike. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping guidelines. All attendees will be muted for the duration of this webinar. However, if you have a question, you can ask it at any time by typing it into your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and we'll answer all of your questions at that time. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please try to note that in the text of your question, and we'll direct it towards them. This webinar is also being recorded. A link to the audio recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation will be sent out following the webinar. And now I'll turn it over to Peter Forbes to introduce our presenters.
So thank you, Jonah. Mike recognized Phil and Michelle, who have been behind the scenes helping to coordinate this. I'm just going to do a very abbreviated intro for Simone Gonsolin and Joe Gagnon, who are our primary presenters today. Their bios are linked in to the webinar on the right-hand side if you want to read up on that. Simone Gonsolin is a principal researcher at AIR, where he serves as director for the National Technical Assistance Center for the Education of Neglected or Delinquent Children and Youth. He's also been part of the planning committee for this education series, so thank you, Simone. Joe Gagnon, PhD, is an associate professor of special ed at the University of Florida. Dr. Gagnon's research focuses on ensuring youth at the greatest risk for educational, behavioral, and social failure are provided the supports necessary for long-term success in school and society. So Simone and Joe are going to take us through a discussion about a very important topic to the field. So I'm going to go right to Simone, I believe. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Peter. Really looking forward to today's webinar. We want to thank the participants. We have over 100 participants for the webinar at this point. Thanks for joining Joe and us in today's conversation. Our webinar is entitled Special Education in Juvenile Correctional Settings, the Law and Practice. So I want to take a few minutes just to give you an overview of what we'll be covering on today's webinar. I'll take the first 3 bullets there that you see on your screen. We'll talk a little bit about the prevalence for children with disabilities in the system, federal laws and entitlements for these students with disabilities, and how they are applicable not only to the public school system, but also to juvenile justice settings and adult correctional settings as well. And also major components of these laws we think that are pretty important for you to know and to follow. Then Joe is going to take a much deeper dive into 3 of these major components: child find, IEPs, or individual education programs, and transition, meaning the transitioning into adulthood for the young person with disabilities. So first I wanted to give you a little data. Many of you who are in the education field, in juvenile justice do in fact know much of this data. But the first thing is, in the public school system, which of course are non-incarcerated youth, right? Approximately 13% of the youth in America's schools have educational disabilities. In contrast, between 30 and 80% of the youth who are incarcerated in America have educational disabilities. So quite a difference there, the number of youth who have disabilities when you compare the youth who are incarcerated versus youth who are in America's public school system. When we compare youth in custody to their non-incarcerated peers, youth in custody are 7 times more likely to have a specific learning disability when compared to, once again, non-incarcerated youth. Youth in custody are 6 times more likely to have an emotional or behavioral disorder, and upwards of 50% of youth who are incarcerated have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Youth in custody are 3 times more eligible for special education services when compared to their non-incarcerated peers. There is a much larger percentage of youth in custody who have slipped through the cracks, so to speak, and are under-identified or oftentimes misidentified. The following federal law is the law of the land, basically, to address the educational needs of youth with disabilities, and it's known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and it covers the need for and availability of appropriate, free, appropriate public education or faith for these eligible children and youth, including young adults, and it talks to least restriction environments, it talks to those special education services that are necessary, as well as related services to help individuals benefit the greatest from their education. It prepares them for further education, employment, and independent living. IDEA governs how states and public agencies provide those services for over 6.5 million young people. In Part B, which is probably the most significant part of IDEA that we will talk about today, is applicable to all children and youth ages 3 through 21. So the information that Joe and I will share with you today is really focusing on the needs of those youth within that age category. So Child Find is one of those major elements in IDEA. One of the things you really want to remember, first of all, is to be aware of Child Find. All juvenile justice settings should always have a Child Find initiative or process in place in order to determine which youth are coming into the facility with an educational disability or which youth may have been missed. As you recall, I said this a little earlier, that many youth in the system are under-identified or misidentified. So there must be awareness across the board within the juvenile justice setting, not just the school setting, but in social services, intake, and those sorts of things. There must be a referral process. So, if in fact in intake you determine that a youngster's had a history of special education, or could have been in the process of being identified as a youth with a disability, there's got to be a way to connect that youngster to continued assessment while he or she is incarcerated. There must be screening for disabilities to determine whether or not additional assessment is needed. And following that, you want to make sure that there is appropriate tracking of the child's progress, because as you are screening the youngster, you also want to put in place interventions, right, to determine if, these interventions such as modifications or accommodations will really work for this youngster and allow them to continue in a regular educational program. You determine eligibility oftentimes through an assortment of assessments or a series of assessments. You provide appropriate services to address the child's disability so they can maximize the benefit from their education. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, what Child Find would be considered one of those major components of IDEA. So under IDEA, another major component is free, appropriate public education, better known as FAPE. And in March of 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District on what appropriate means. If you talk to one person, whether it be a juvenile justice expert, an educational expert, obviously there will be different ways to define what appropriate is. But the court declared that the child's education, and this is for youth who has an education disability, must reasonably establish services and supports that enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So, based on the youngster's disabilities, right, it has nothing to do with the child's environment, whether they're in a public school system or in a juvenile justice setting. So no longer is the standard of appropriate education, meaning the youngster makes some benefit from the educational services that are offered to them. And this is typically done in establishing an individual education program for the youngster, or IEP, which involves parents, teachers, professionals, the youth, especially if it's an older child, and any significant others in this child's life who can provide input and knowledge and have knowledge of the youngster's needs. So what does FAPE mean, or what does free appropriate private education mean? So we know, number one, these services must be provided at no cost to the parent. They have to meet state standards, so they cannot be substandard. It needs to be the same standards that the public school systems are held to there in the state. It includes appropriate education, in other words, meeting that youngster's needs based on that IEP, and it must conform to the IEP that has been developed by a team of individuals who, in fact, know this youngster very well. Other components of FAPE, especially on the free education section, or the F of FAPE, districts cannot deny FAPE based on the cost of services. Costs can be considered when serving options available. So, it's not like you always have to provide the Cadillac of a particular service. It's a service, with vendor A, say this speech therapist is $75, and with another speech therapist is $65, you don't have to go after the $75 speech therapy services per hour. You can go after the $65 if, in fact, those services are appropriate for the youngster. Also, the needs to be reasonably calculated in light of the child's circumstances. So it really allows the youngsters to meet some challenging objectives that appear on their IEP. So those state standards we talked about, they have to be free, they have to be appropriate, and so they have to really adhere to state standards. Once again, they must meet or exceed federal standards. Special ed and related services must meet the state standards. And once again, teachers must meet licensure certification requirements for the state. Under appropriate education, when you look at the components of FAPE, there are a few that you want to consider here. First of all, FAPE is delineated in the child's IEP, so it's written up in this legal binding document. The IEP is developed in collaboration with the child's parent. They are a decision maker in the IEP process. The IEP describes the student's needs, details special education and related services to be provided. And there's always a list of students' goals. So what is it this youngster is going to accomplish during this year of school? Also, if in fact school authorities are going to make any sort of adjustment in the IEP, it has to be reasonably calculated, and you have to have a certifiable reason, especially in a juvenile justice setting where oftentimes you see youngsters coming into the settings with IEPs and those services are reduced because they're in a juvenile justice setting, but that is not acceptable. This is something that, if there is a reduction in services in the juvenile justice setting, you have to identify why you're making those decisions and why that's the appropriate decision for that youth. It can't be just because this youngster is in a juvenile justice setting. And then finally, transition services for those youth who are, it's mandatory for those youth who are turning 16 years of age, and for those youth who are age 14 it may be considered as well. And these are transitional services and supports that they need in order to be successful adults as they enter adulthood. Under related services, these are basically considered supportive services needed for the student to really benefit from special education. Most of the time, in our particular settings, you're looking at things such as speech therapy, school-based counseling, not just the counseling that happens by the unit staff or by their social worker or their case manager on the unit, but this is additional behavior counseling at the school level, physical therapy, occupational therapy potentially. And these, of course, should be done at no cost to the parent. Sorry about that, went the wrong way. Under IDEA, the right to services are not terminated with the awarding of a GED. Sometimes you see in the juvenile justice system where the youngster has a GED, they say, okay, they're no longer eligible for special educational services. However, the termination of those services on their 22nd birthday, or if they should receive a high school diploma, traditional high school diploma. So even a youngster who has a GED can receive special education services and supports as they further their education beyond that particular IEP. And of course, the IEP team is inclusive of parents and youth, as I mentioned a little earlier. The final component that I'm going to talk about under IDEA are the behavioral considerations. IDEA affords disabled youth behavioral considerations and protections when there is a history of behavioral concerns, especially when disciplinary action is considered. This may indicate that the behavioral supports should be included in the child's IEP and provided. For a juvenile justice setting, this could be somewhat difficult, especially if you're looking at housing that is not in the traditional sense and the youngsters are not receiving schooling within the traditional community schools, so to speak, within the facility. If the student's behaviors persist, it typically means the behavioral supports that they're currently receiving are not working. They're not meeting the youngster's needs, so it's imperative that the IEP committee reconvene to address these behaviors in a different manner, providing additional support or identifying ways that they can alter the approach of the youngster. And finally, the behavioral supports and services provided are to be research-based and individualized. The services should not be cookie cutter. In that sense, it should be addressing that youngster's particular needs as identified in the evaluation of that youngster and also in the IEP. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you. Joe is going to take 3 of these large components that I talked about a little earlier and is going to drill just a little deeper to let you know what this looks like at the school setting. And without any further delay, you have it, Joe.
Excellent, thank you. I'm real happy to be a part of this. This is a really important topic, and the details that I think we talk about can really affect a lot of kids, in a positive way if they're adhered to. And so I want to just talk a little bit about a few of the provisions within IDEA and look at some of the common problems and situations that require attention based on my visiting numbers of facilities, my work as a consultant, my work with lawsuits, and there's some common issues that a lot of facilities have to deal with, and so I want to bring those up and get into just a little bit of what sorts of things that you can do. But honestly, we can really just touch the surface on a lot of these things. And I'm happy to talk with people afterwards. You feel free to contact me because the way that each facility the way that each jurisdiction, school district, and state really addresses some of these problems is individualized in a way. Because you all have a different situation, there's some different ways that you want to perhaps try to solve problems that maybe another facility, another district or state could not. But let's get into some of the specifics. So with regards to Child 5, the thing that I want to mention is, you know, IDA is very specific, and it's almost like a recipe, which makes it real easy for those of us that take a look at it and are able to make recommendations. All right, but you see, in terms of exchange of records, the new public agency, which is the Juvenile Correctional Facility, must take reasonable steps to promptly obtain the child's records. Now, there are a few words in there that are a bit ambiguous, and so that does cause a little bit of problems. But the idea is that it is the responsibility of the receiving agency of the facility to get the student records. The other thing that I want to mention that doesn't really get talked about much is that the state also has a responsibility in this. And I think we need to make sure that we include the state in our conversations, because they are also required, with regards to Child Find, to make sure that there's policies and procedures to ensure, and you can see here, a practical method to determine which children are receiving special education and related services, and those that are going into juvenile correctional facilities. And it does apply to correctional facilities as well. Let me see if I got this right. Okay, so let's look at a few issues that are real common with regards to record exchange. The first thing is, I want to just say that reasonable steps really equates to the idea that there are standardized policies and procedures that can be followed by dedicated staff, and that a lot of the problems with regard to record exchange are that there's not a specific dedicated person, or that what you have is somebody that's a very dedicated professional, but there's not really the policies and the procedures for them to work within. And so what ends up happening is some facilities do a great job with Child Find because they have a real dynamic go-getter that contacts schools, that goes around, you know, that really works hard sort of on their own. And I think what we need to do in a lot of cases where there's problems like this is we have to look toward standardization. And the standardization of policies and procedures in a lot of cases is part of the solution or the solution for issues. The other thing is that, you know, going back to the state, and the state has a responsibility to develop policies and procedures. And, you know, there are policies and procedures at the state level with regard to record exchange. But I think we also have to recognize that juvenile correctional facilities are different, and there are complications. And sometimes the state level people need to look at the policies and procedures and say, okay, how do we need to adjust to make record exchange practical between a juvenile correctional facility and the local school district? So another part of Child Find requires that there are general education interventions. Now, it's not necessary that a student has general education interventions before being recommended for an evaluation, but it is necessary to get an understanding of the student's functioning. And so when we look at what are effective general education interventions, then we know that these students have a right to research-based or evidence-based instruction in the general education classroom. Now, if they're not getting that, then you can see how it's going to be very difficult to know who needs to be evaluated for special education. The other thing is that rather than looking at IDA or federal policies, we typically have to look at state policies with regards to the number of hours or minutes of instruction. And juvenile correctional facilities are held to the same standard as any school within the state. And so we have to look and compare, well, in my facility or in the facility that I work with or that I oversee, is there the same number of instructional hours or minutes? Now, a couple of things that based on my experience, and that is a lot of facilities, I'll go in and what it is students sitting there doing worksheets, answering questions from a textbook, and I have to say that that approach is not instruction, okay? It is providing them with information and asking them to answer questions, but that is not instruction, and it's not evidence-based, okay? It can be a component of instruction, but if that's the only thing that's occurring in that classroom, then the teacher is not providing instruction. And so that's one thing to look at when you go in, or if you're a teacher, to evaluate what you're doing, to say, you know, is what's supposed to be happening actually happening? Are students getting their legal right to research-based instruction in a general education classroom? The other thing that's a real difficult issue is instructional time. Some schools, some juvenile correctional schools are not open all day. Kids will go for half a day or a couple hours, which is just simply not legal and is something that should be looked at right from the onset. But the other thing is the complication of dealing with, you know, the correctional officers who may think that it's a hassle to go pick up kids and bring them to school. It's easier for them to stay in their cell, and you know, maybe they say they called them out and they refused. And so it really does mean working with the correctional officers as well to make sure that students get to class. The other issue that I see over and over again in terms of providing these required general education interventions is that there's not a plan for substitute teachers. And this really falls on facility administrators and, you know, those people that are responsible for funding. Because in a lot of facilities I'll look at the attendance records of teachers, and, you know, it's because it's a 365-day school year or more or less, then what you'll see is on Friday and Monday the teachers don't show up. And so what happens is the kids, in effect, don't get a full school day or all the instructional hours that they are required to have. Now, there's a couple issues. Some of the reasons that teachers end up doing just worksheets is because the burden on teachers is just tremendous in so many facilities, where you can have teachers being asked to teach in content areas that are not their area of expertise. Maybe they're asked to teach geometry, algebra, all in the same classroom. Maybe they're asked to teach algebra and biology in the same classroom. And so that's a systemic issue that I think we need to look at from a big picture, because a lot of times teachers are put into unworkable situations where the idea of providing instruction is almost impossible to really truly help students. Another issue that I think is important in terms of general education interventions is that we have to evaluate if students are being successful. And this falls on the teachers, which means the teachers need to collect and analyze data on students relating to their academic work and their behavioral progress. Okay, and that means, you know, collecting information. How are they doing on their assignments? And setting up a system, you know, beyond just getting a write-up, setting up a system, even something simple that says, you know, every hour I'm just going to mark a check if this student has been on task. Something so that we know, is the general education environment working? Without the collection and analysis of information, it's almost impossible to identify if things are working, if different adaptations need to be made, or if the student requires a special education evaluation. The other thing that I don't think is commonly known is that students should be directly observed in the general education classroom. And that has to be part of the process. If a student is failing, if a student has the potential to need to be evaluated for special education evaluation. So just know that that direct observation is something that even a principal could help with. So another aspect of child find and this notion of general education interventions is the issue of curriculum. Okay, so again, we have to look toward state level policies in terms of what are the number of credits and the required courses in that state for a high school diploma. And juvenile correctional facilities are required, just like any high school, just like a high school that your child went to, you want them to have access to the courses that they need and be able to accumulate those courses to get their high school diploma. And unfortunately, this becomes a juggling act where there may be courses that are not offered. There may not be teachers qualified to teach certain courses. I heard an interesting idea a couple of weeks ago where someone was saying, you know, wouldn't it be great if juvenile correctional facilities and public schools did like teacher sharing, where a geometry teacher could come to a facility and teach for a class or two throughout the week, and maybe even a juvenile correctional facility teacher could go into the public school in an exchange, which would help them keep their foot in sort of the normality of a public school. And I think there are some creative ways to deal with these sorts of issues, but that's one potential one. The other thing that I see very common is that, you know, states and districts have policies, they have adopted textbooks. And again, juvenile correctional facilities should have the adopted textbooks just like any other middle school or high school. Now, in terms of the required courses that are offered, some of the things that I see that facilities struggle with are the idea of providing electives. And I think that, you know, it's not optional to provide electives. If students need X number of elective course credits, they have to be offered. The other is technical or vocational education. And I'll talk a little bit more about that during transition. A few other issues are languages, right? You have to have 2 years of Spanish or whatever it is, and laboratory science, such as chemistry. So I think it's important, again, every facility is going to have to figure out, how are we going to do this? How can we work with the school district, with other schools, and try and ensure that we provide these courses that are required. And there are some creative laboratory science programs, that software that can actually provide them with a laboratory experience when you can't necessarily have a Bunsen burner in a juvenile correctional facility. And then, of course, that course availability should be based on the state policies, not on teacher availability. A couple of issues that I also want to mention related to curriculum is that the textbooks and materials must align with the district and state policies, which I mentioned, but also in terms of the state assessments, so that the information on which students are assessed is actually related to the textbook and material that they're provided. I've gone to many facilities where GED preparation supplants high school curriculum and high school courses, which is not really legal for a student with disability. But you can work with this, just like you can work with vocational courses. The idea is that GED Prep vocational courses can be used as electives, and so that you can still make sure that students with disabilities get the general education curriculum, the courses that they're required to, and then also have some experience with GED Prep. And we know that a lot of these kids have few credits, and GED Prep is probably the way to go for them. So it's not an either or. The question is, how do we make sure that we can fit in GED Prep and vocational courses while still giving them the general academic courses? In terms of child find, I just want to mention the other thing in terms of the state, not just simply with regards to record exchange, okay, but just more broadly, the fact that the state is required to provide support, policies and procedures overall in terms of making sure that students are identified, located, and evaluated. And in this sense, I think it's also relying on the state to provide policies and procedures to make sure that there's compliance. And part of the reason that there are so many lawsuits against juvenile correctional facilities is that I think that nobody's paying attention sometimes. And one way is for the state to do what they need to do, which is ensure compliance. They have to be sure that the child find is happening. And as I mentioned before, that it's not always going to be a perfect fit with what's going on in the public schools, because these juvenile correctional facilities, they are different, and they are going to require some different tweaks in how the policies and procedures are implemented. So the next topic that I want to mention relates to individual education programs, IEPs. And again, I want to just talk about the specifics within IDEA and then link it to what I observe commonly and what an administrator or teacher or a special education leader can all look for and monitor in their own facility or cross facilities to make sure that these common issues are noticed and addressed to the best that they can be. So in terms of IEPs, the state must ensure each public agency, all right, that children with disabilities have available to them programs and services that are consistent with children without disabilities, which means that this is a way to essentially say that there's no one in a juvenile correctional facility that should not have a high school program and coursework that is any different than any other public school. And I know that's a very difficult thing to hear because it is so complicated, but legally they are required to have this. And the state is responsible for monitoring and enforcing this. And I think that it's important that states actually do that. Now, rarely do I see specific observation and monitoring and enforcement. And I think that's something that is a systemic issue and that people need to look at as a systemic issue. All right? And because you don't have parents showing up and asking questions all the time, and it is really important that there is a very conscious and visible effort to monitor and enforce the basic rights of youth with disabilities. So in terms of IEP, all right, facilities are responsible for providing services that are comparable to the child's IEP from the previous public agency. Now, when I go into a facility, I look at a student's IEP, and then I go back to the IEP that they had from the public school. Because what happens a lot of times once they get into juvenile corrections, once they get into the system, is whatever services they had in public school will get dropped way down, often out of necessity, okay? The idea that they had 300 minutes of special education and that's just not possible in a facility, and it drops down to, 20. And the idea is that just being in a juvenile correctional facility, just being in a situation where there's correctional officers, does not replace the services that they need for special education in school. And that's an argument that I've heard before too, which is, well, they're in a structured setting. Well, yes, but that alone, there's no evidence that that alone supports them enough to achieve their IEP goals, okay? So if you're looking at IEPs, I would say evaluate IEPs, student IEPs, look at their current IEP, and then go back to their public school IEP. Are they getting speech and language? Did they get speech and language when they were in the public school? And then it dropped off once they entered the system, and now it's just gone. So I think it's important to go back and make sure that wherever you are, however many facilities this kid's been in, that you can go back and say, are we actually giving this kid what they need, or are we adapting the IEP to the facility? In terms of IEP implementation, the IEP, it's important that it meets the child's needs in order to make progress in the general education curriculum. Now, this is really difficult because we know that a lot of these kids are really low and they have few credits, they're functioning, but probably their reading is around 5th grade level. So but the idea is, because since 2004, since IDEA 2004 and then the regulations, we are required as teachers to try and say, all right, what instructional adaptations do I need to give this student so they can still access the curriculum? If they can't multiply and they have to do geometry or algebra, can I give them a calculator that will allow them to still look at algebraic concepts, even if they aren't focused on or using multiplication skills? Now, that's one very simple example, and this is a huge challenge for teachers in public school in general, but in juvenile correctional facilities especially. But the idea is that we have to adapt instruction so that they can take the same coursework. And that's one of the biggest things or issues that I see in facilities, is that essentially they're just given worksheets on their level, and they're never actually provided the support to try and do anything else. And we know that doesn't work, because you're going to end up with kids that are 17 years old and they're still working on multiplication tables, and they're never going to get to even have any experience with algebraic concepts, for example. So what are some issues that I see that need to be looked at and evaluated within facilities? Okay, so students must earn credits for courses while they are incarcerated, according to SF. And I think that's something that a lot of facilities have done in the last several years. So that's less of an issue now, but I just want to make sure it's noted. Students with disabilities are guaranteed the same number of instructional minutes per day and week as non-disabled students. And what that essentially means is that they are also required to have the same number of instructional minutes per day and week as anybody in any school in a given state, based on those state requirements. The difficulty also is when you look at students in segregation, they are also have a right to the same number of instructional minutes per day and week. And that does not mean standing at the door and talking to them through the door for 10 minutes and then giving them worksheets which are picked up the next day. Now, how you do that for student segregation is something very complicated, which we can't get into now. But what's important to know is that by being in a juvenile correctional facility or by being in segregation, they do not give up their rights to have the same number of instructional minutes per day and week and access to the same curriculum. On IEPs, if you're looking at evaluating IEPs, another thing that I often see is just a lot of real sort of, not a lot of specificity. And I think it's good perhaps to take a look at the goals, look at what the students are doing, see how the goals relate to helping them access the general education curriculum. Sometimes, you know, teachers or whoever's writing the IEP needs a little bit of help to sort this out, but it's an important thing to sort of think about. Other issues about requiring attention. Students need a curriculum that's aligned with state academic and career and technical education standards. That came out of the U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Department of Justice a couple of years ago. And again, I think that's a great thing to aspire to. Again, going back to IDEA, students with disabilities, teachers must provide evidence-based instructional adaptations. And just a workbook page or just a worksheet is not an instructional adaptation. And so it really requires some professional development if teachers aren't sure what it is that they need to do. As I mentioned, students in segregation are also entitled to the same services, educational services, as students in the general population.
Hey, Joe, I hate to interrupt real quick. Just want to make sure you're aware of the time and that we leave enough time for some questions at the end.
Yep, so I just have about 2 minutes left. Is that good?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So in terms of transition, I highlighted a couple of things, but you know, the transition for students on their IEP, the most important thing are these first couple words: a coordinated and consistent set of activities. And a lot of times on IEPs, I'll see we'll explore what jobs they want to do. And I think if you go down and you read all the different things, includes instruction, related services, community experience, which is difficult, but if you start looking at those, then you can see what needs to be addressed in this coordinated and consistent set of activities. And I'll just say, just make sure that vocational courses need to be provided, and they need to make sure that students with disabilities are not excluded up front. And a lot of facilities have prerequisites which students with disabilities can never master. So the question is, how do you assist them so that they can be successful? And vocational courses need a scope and sequence. Just mopping the floor or dishing food in the cafeteria is not really a vocational course. It's probably useful experience, but vocational courses need to be developed with a scope and sequence. The last thing I'll say is that it's important to have formalized cross-agency collaboration and written procedures and transition-related forms to help students when they enter and when they exit a facility.
And then, Joe, thank you so much for the great information. I just wanted to highlight 4 resources that may be helpful to you with IDEA. First of all, from University, Lehigh University, there's a national update on case law, which takes a look at any lawsuits that have occurred since 1998 under IDEA in Section 504 with the juvenile justice setting. IndyTax has a issue brief on free appropriate public education that Joe was the main author for that you may want to look at on our website. Then in December 2014, the U.S. Departments of Justice and Education jointly issued a Dear Colleague letter on providing special educational services in juvenile justice settings. And then, of course, there is the U.S. Department of Education IDEA website. And I think that'll do it for us. Phil, if there are any questions, we're happy to answer them.
Sure, we have lots of questions, actually. Probably not enough time to cover them. But let me start with you, Simone. Early on, you gave a statistic that there were 30 to 80% of incarcerated youth who have learning disabilities, and you made a comparison to public schools. Where did those stats come from, and why do you think the range is from 30 to 80%?
The resources in which these were found were resources that were located over a number of years, and I think it just depends oftentimes on how well the researchers actually delved into whether or not a youngster truly had a disability. If they walked in the door with an IEP or an evaluation, those may be the only youngsters that were counted, versus those youngsters who were under-identified or misidentified. So I think that's the variance. I think also the method in which it was utilized and how deeply they looked at the data in order to determine whether or not it was appropriate or not. But Joe, you may have a little more information on that, being a researcher at the University of Florida. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it well, Simone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, another 2 people actually were interested in examples of facilities that have provided effective instruction, thinking about curriculum and the environment, scheduling practices, and so on.
I'll say that I'm hesitant to promote any specific facility, only because a lot of facilities are always in such flux that if a few people leave, you could go back in another month and it would be unrecognizable.
But rather than identify a facility, how about just describing what makes such a facility different? Like, what is good practice?
I think.
So, Joe, do you want me to go ahead? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Simone.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think number one, I think Joe and I both focused on this, was having the appropriate recruitment and retention of teachers who are qualified and licensed to teach kids who may have had some successful experiences in the public school system and working with youth who have emotional behavior disorders. I think that's key. Secondly, that there is a full day of school, as Joe mentioned, and this means getting youngsters to class on time, not 10 minutes late every morning because breakfast is running over, or holding them back, for one reason or another, because a youngster hasn't made it back from a infirmary visit, or meds were late, be given out, or that sort of thing. school has to be considered a priority. And once it's considered a priority in a facility, good things tend to happen for not only the facility, the kids, and the teachers, but I mean, the kids make astronomical progress when school really becomes a priority within that facility, not only in policy, but also in practice. And then, as Joe mentioned, as far as for a student who has disabilities, it's providing those educational services that are individually tailored to their needs and that are addressed, on a daily basis. And Joe, I think, hit the biggest thing in my mind. Open your textbooks and read the chapter on development of democracy within the civics handbook, and then answer the 17 questions that follow that chapter is not instruction. It can be part of the instructional day or what a youngster does within the school week, but certainly that is not the instruction. It's the level of teacher-student interaction or student using technology under the teacher's leadership that, to me, makes a quality educational program. Joe, what did I leave out there?
I think that was a great explanation, Simone.
Right. Can I I have to squeeze in a couple more questions here.
Yeah.
What are some suggestions about strategies to get line staff on board with behavioral challenges of youth with IEPs?
So, Joe, I'll go for it first, and then you can jump in there. I think, number one, the frontline staff, they've got to have knowledge of what the youngster's behavioral or emotional supports are. What will make this youngster, what will help this youngster be more successful behaviorally or emotionally? I think that can be done through staff development, the exchange of information between the educational staff and the frontline staff is just critically important. Oftentimes in many facilities, the educational programming is handled through a contract or through another agency or that sort of thing. And it's almost like the educators are guests on the grounds of the facility and they are the day program. As a correctional educator, I've always resisted that title of the day program. For the youth, it is programming for the youngster, and in my mind, that both the frontline staff and the educational staff need to be engaged in really helping that youngster. If the youngster has an IEP, they should be aware of what's in the IEP. I mean, not every single detail, because there's not enough time probably for the frontline staff to know that or to gain that knowledge. But certainly whatever is part of that child's behavioral goals, oftentimes there is a functional behavior assessment that's done by a school psychologist, school social worker to determine what's really the underlying reasons for the youth exhibiting the behaviors that are oftentimes causing problems with the facility. And then an individual behavior plan is developed based on that. And I think that frontline staff member, if we can have enough consistency there, because I think that's part of it, should be part of either the explanation of the behavioral improvement plan or be part of that child's individual behavior improvement plan development, so that they see themselves as part of the team, as part of the group that's really addressing the youngster's needs. Joe?
And I think that working with an individual student's behavioral needs has to be looked at within the greater context of the facility. And, and that really comes from the COs, from the education director, and how they work together and conceptualize what we know about what effectively changing youth behavior. And then they have to take that and create a system in which that can happen. And then it's not a matter of having an individual plan for every student, with or without a disability necessarily. If they're in an environment that is structured, for example, that takes into consideration trauma and, in trauma-informed care within the CEOs, within the education, that doesn't mean kids get away with stuff, but there are ways that have been proven to effectively change behavior within a system And then those individual plans, they've become a little bit easier. They're not like islands within a sea of chaos.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, so I'm going to turn things back to Peter or Mike.
Yeah, this is Peter Forbes. Thank you very much. It would have been great to have another half hour for Q&A. There's a lot of really good stuff going on in that conversation toward the end. But I want to thank Joe and Simone for taking the time to do this, Phil for helping to facilitate. Our final segment on the educational series is going to be a kind of a policy implication wrap-up, and we're in the process of sketching that out, and we will get that out to the field so folks know when that is. We want that to be a meaningful wrap-up. And the other administrative note is that there's a survey link with 4 simple questions. It would be great if we could get the input of people that attended today. Thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.